Bryan, lovely to have you here. To start with, what is our understanding of how these drugs act on the brain in as simple a term as possible?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Excuse me, thank you very much. So currently, our understanding is that these drugs interact with a particular receptor site in the brain, which is the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, which you can see behind me. I have structures of the various receptors that these drugs interact with, as well as the structures of many psychedelic drugs. And following their interaction with this particular receptor, what happens is they cause what we call asynchronous firing of layer 5 pyramidal neurons in the brain. And these neurons are essential for integrating information across multiple cortical areas to give us a perspective on how we view reality. So in essence, what these drugs do is they induce noise in the system, in the very neurons or cells in the brain that are essential for how we view reality. And this noise is interpreted by the brain as a psychedelic experience.
Okay, and I'm going to ask you the question. Do we need a trip to get the beneficial effects of psychedelic?
So we don't know. And that's the, I would say, in scientific terms, we call it a testable hypothesis. So the goal of our research is to see if we can create medications or medication-like compounds that interact directly and selectively with this particular receptor, the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, and which activate particular signaling pathways downstream of the receptor, which are essential for the therapeutic actions of psychedelic drugs, but do not cause a psychedelic experience. So I can say that we and others have shown, at least in mice, that it is possible to create such compounds that are apparently therapeutic in the sense that they are effective at treating depression-like syndromes in mice and anxiety-like syndromes in mice, but do not cause effects reminiscent of psychedelic drugs. Of course, studies in mice are preliminary, and ultimately we'll only know if these drugs are not psychedelic when they're tested in humans.
Yeah, of course. And how do you define psychedelic? Kind of where do we draw the line of when a psychedelic drug then gets changed so much that it's then not a psychedelic anymore?
Right, so the gold standard would be to administer the medications to humans. This would typically be done in what's called a phase 1 clinical trial, and then to simply ask them if they've had a psychedelic experience. And so I'm sure as most people in the audience are aware, the psychedelic experience is not subtle, and it should be fairly straightforward early on in clinical trials to determine if these compounds are psychedelic or not.
Okay, and what do you see are the problems with making these psychedelics less psychedelic? What would you say to those that say we're missing an opportunity and a paradigm shift of treating people in a whole new way?
Well, I would say that's certainly possible. As I said, we're testing the hypothesis that you can make a drug that's not psychedelic and it would still be therapeutic. Although I would say that's in the realm of a question that we're currently trying to test. What I would say to people who are, I would say, enthusiastic about the psychedelic experience is that it may indeed be that the psychedelic experience is absolutely essential to the therapeutic actions of the drugs, but it may also be that it's not. And if the psychedelic experience is absolutely essential for the actions of these drugs, then unfortunately, there will be huge swaths of the world population that will ultimately not tolerate such an experience. So, for example, if you have a family history of schizophrenia, so I have a family history of schizophrenia. My mother had schizophrenia. I would not be eligible to, and I was depressed, or a family member of mine was depressed and wanted to try psychedelic therapy as a potential treatment. Ordinarily, we would not be eligible for those trials because of the concern that a psychedelic drug may induce either a transient or long-lasting psychotic experience in individuals that have schizophrenia. As well, if you look at the clinical trial design, most people with serious mental illnesses other than depression are excluded. Individuals typically have to be off their medication when they're given a psychedelic drug trial. And I'm sure as many people in the audience are well aware, if you're depressed, probably the last thing in the world that you want to do is to go off your antidepressant medications for several weeks to then go and have a psychedelic experience. The final thing is monetary. So even though drugs like psilocybin and LSD are showing really dramatic potential for treating a number of neuropsychiatric disorders, we saw earlier today the really remarkable effects of 2 doses of LSD for treating anxiety from MindMed. These require relatively long and expensive interactions with trained therapists. And I would say when this therapy is rolled out to the general public, there are likely to be significant economic pressures for rolling this out to the general population. I would say sadly, but I think that's probably the reality of the situation. So if we had a medication that was as effective or nearly as effective as a psychedelic drug for treating depression and anxiety, but didn't result in many of these sort of negative aspects of basically rolling it out to the general public, then it would transform how we treat a number of neuropsychiatric disorders.
Yeah. And obviously you're looking at novel treatments at the moment. What in your lab are you most excited about?
Well, 2 things. One thing is my lab is continuing sort of our long-standing studies on trying to understand how psychedelic drugs exert their actions. And as you can see behind me, we've solved a number of structures of psychedelic drugs interacting with their receptors, and these structures will be very useful for what's called structure-based drug discovery. The other thing is we have data in mice. We haven't published it yet, but we have data in mice suggesting that it's possible to induce a very robust and long-lasting therapeutic drug-like response in mice without a psychedelic experience. And I think that's particularly interesting, and as I say, would be transformative for our treatment of many psychiatric disorders.
Yeah. And you mentioned in your previous answer that a psychedelic without a trip might be an option for those with schizophrenia or a family history of schizophrenia. Is there any evidence or studies backing that up?
No. All we know is that taking a conventional psychedelic is absolutely contraindicated if you have a history of schizophrenia, and relatively contraindicated if you have a family history of schizophrenia. Our anticipation is that these medications would be safe for individuals that fall into this risk category, but of course we won't know for sure until clinical trials are done.
Okay. And we just had a lot of new people join us in the auditorium. As a final closing point, what do you think is the most important take-home message from this talk?
I would say the most important thing is that we don't know for sure if the psychedelic experience is essential for the therapeutic actions of psychedelic drugs. And I know this is an area that is fraught with intense opinions, basically on both sides of the argument. So there are individuals out there and groups that say the psychedelic experience is absolutely essential to the therapeutic actions of these drugs, and others who say that the psychedelic experience is irrelevant to the therapeutic actions of these drugs. And what I say is we don't know, and but it's something we can test, and certainly if such medications were available, they would really open the door for treatment to a huge proportion of the world's population.
Yeah,
so the potential for decreasing human suffering is tremendous.
I think that's a really powerful point to end on. So we'll wrap up there. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks for coming.